So here's what I'm praying for in the next few moments, is that there would be a beautiful collision where God's grace and mercy would collide with our guilt and shame. I don't know what your most memorable Facebook message has been. I want to tell you about mine. I'd rather just read this to you, but it's a little bit long, so you'll have to stick with it. I got this around 5 years ago or so from a man in his late 30s named Wes, and here's what he wrote to me. He writes, I don't know if you have any good Facebook stories. All right, now he's got my attention. I think you might have one after you read this. I'm not exactly sure why, but I feel compelled by God to tell you the story. It goes all over the place. I've known I was adopted all my life. I was raised in a Christian home by two terrific people who could not have children of their own. I'm married now. I have my own children, and I dearly love my family. Honestly, I never had a desire, he writes, to seek out my birth parents until a few years ago. I was attending a Christian retreat, and one of the speakers was an older man, and he told about giving up a child for adoption many years ago, but he had never told anyone about it. And he just said he lived with that secret. He lived with guilt and a hard heart, and he lived with bitterness towards God until his daughter, who was at the time an adult and a committed follower of Christ, contacted him. And as he shared at the retreat, he said that God used that to help him find freedom and to find healing. And so he writes, that story made me think of my own situation. I wondered if it might help my birth parents to know how I was doing. And I was able to find the name of my birth father, and I contacted him. It became clear to me that I was right about guilt and pain that can follow a person after making such a difficult decision, especially when they don't tell anyone about it. That secret had been kept for a long time, and it seemed that it was probably best that I not interfere with his life or complicate things for him. Recently, my family changed cable providers to Verizon, and they carry the religious station JCTV. He writes, one night I was laying in bed with my wife and one of your shows came on and my wife was watching it and I was already half asleep, but suddenly I was startled when my wife exclaimed, "Oh my gosh, that is your cousin." She was talking about you, Kyle. She knew a lot more about my birth family than I did because she's the one who did all the research. And I didn't believe her at first, but after a little Google search, I realized she was correct. I hope you're not shocked, but your uncle, this is my dad's little brother, your uncle, David Idleman, is my birth father. I picked you to contact first because as a pastor, I thought you might be used to giving counsel in difficult situations. I know that I also have a sister, but I don't know if she knows about me. I don't want to stir the family pot. I don't want to create problems or difficult situations, but I feel like, as I said, God compelled me to reach out to you. So Wes's father is my Uncle Dave, who I grew up pretty close to. He lived in the same town that I did. He's my dad's little brother, never told anybody about this son that he gave up for adoption. But a secret like that, here's the thing about it. It's a heavy weight to carry, especially over an extended period of time. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Like it starts off, it's okay. You think, I can handle this weight. But a secret, the weight starts to bear down. And as I look back on it, I guess that's sort of how I would describe my uncle. He seemed to me as a man who carried a heavy weight. God and the church didn't play much of a factor in his life, and I just think the decades of carrying a secret like that took its toll on his heart and on his relationships. And when you keep a secret like that, you find out that shame and guilt are your constant companions. But over the decades, it turns out that he was on a collision course with God's grace and mercy. That's true for some of you. You don't even know it. Like you think you just came here today on chance. Some of you came here because really, honestly, you just want to get somebody off your back. But what if it's not an accident that you're here today? What if your life has been on a collision course for this day and this moment and this time and this place? We're in a series leading up to Easter called Beautiful Collision. And as we talked about last week, those words don't tend to go together, beautiful and collision, because collision brings to mind things like broken, busted, wrecked. But that's really what you read in the Gospels. The Gospels are a collection of beautiful collisions where broken and busted and wrecked lives collide with Jesus and something beautiful happens. That's really what we have here at the church as well. It's one story after another of beautiful collisions. And so we're going through different examples of this in the Gospels. Last week we looked at John chapter 3. We saw a beautiful collision between Jesus and a religious leader named Nicodemus. And it was kind of an unusual collision because you have this guy, Nicodemus, who has to choose between following Jesus or following religion. Couldn't do both. Jesus collides with religion. He collides with the traditions. He collides with the self-righteousness and the self-sufficiency that religion offers. And this week, we're gonna be in the next chapter. So if you have your Bibles or a Bible app, turn to John chapter 4. It's a much different kind of collision with a much different kind of person. In fact, in some ways, and this is one of the reasons I love the Gospels, in John 3 and John 4, you're seeing Jesus encounter people on the extreme ends of the religious spectrum, of the social spectrum. And so in John chapter 4, Jesus is traveling. He's getting ready to go to another city. And here's what we read, John 4, verse 4. Here's what it says. He had to go through Samaria. If you want to underline a word or highlight it, had is an interesting word to take note of in this verse. It's easy to miss. He had to go through Samaria. It doesn't really get our attention. Just seems like, well, he had to go there to get to wherever he was going, but that's not necessarily the case. You do a little research on it and you find out that Jews, they didn't want to go through Samaria and they would go around it. They'd do their best to stay out of Samaria. There's a lot of prejudice, a lot of hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans. But as you read the story, you pick up on it pretty quickly that Jesus isn't forced to do that. If anything, it seems that he went out of his way to go to Samaria. It seems like he had to go, more in the sense that he had an appointment that he had to keep. More like that. More that he looked on the calendar and he saw that he was supposed to be at a specific place at a specific time and he had to get there because that's what was on the calendar. It's one of my favorite parts about being a pastor is getting a glimpse at God's calendar. Because his calendar rarely matches up with ours. You know where I see this a lot of times is in the baptistry. When we'll have a special baptism weekend, there'll often be people who come forward to be baptized that weren't planning on getting baptized. Like they came to church that day and that was not part of the plan. And so when I'm in the baptistry, I'll sometimes say, were you planning on getting baptized today? And sometimes they'll say no. And I will say, well, this may not have been on your calendar. This was on God's calendar. God knows. And sometimes he has the intersection circled and he knows when the collision's gonna take place. About 7 or 8 years ago, I finished preaching this sermon and I offered the invitation and this guy comes forward. It was on Saturday night and he was a little emotional when he came down and I asked him his name, told me his name, said he hadn't been to church since he was a kid. And I said, well, what's going on? How can I pray for you? And he said, well, he said that he and his wife had separated and he had made some pretty significant mistakes and he knew he needed to make some changes in his life and someone told him that he should come to church and so here he is and so I prayed for him and I prayed that God would intervene in his marriage. I prayed that God would draw he and his wife back together again, that he would work on their behalf, that he would fight for them. I didn't think too much more of it really until Sunday morning. I get done preaching Sunday morning and offer the invitation. A number of people come forward, but there's 2 ladies that come forward. It turned out they were sisters, and one had her arm around the other, and you could tell that the sister she had her arm around was a little upset, and she came down. I didn't really even have to ask her why they were coming down. She just started telling me. She said that she and her husband recently separated. She hadn't been to church in a long time. And she asked me if I would pray for her husband. And she said that, it would take a miracle, but asked if I would pray. My heart's beating pretty fast at this point. And I said, well, I didn't get a chance to catch your name. What's your name? She told me her name. You ever have that feeling that God just kind of, winks at you? It's one of those moments. I said, your husband came forward last night after church and asked for prayer because he knew he needed to make some changes in his life. She didn't believe me. And God just winks. He knows. Do you ever have that? I just can't help but wonder if maybe this is that moment for some of you. So Jesus heads to Samaria. He says he had to go there. In John chapter 4, it's around noon when he gets there, and he comes to a well, and Jesus sits down and he rests while the disciples go in and get some food. It would not be a normal place and time to meet someone at a well in the heat of the day, because the women typically would come to the well early in the morning when it was cool, or perhaps late in the evening when it was cool, but not in the heat of the day. But sure enough, one woman just happens to come to get some water. It's also unusual that she would come by herself, because in those days, the women would go as a group. It's kind of like for women going to the restroom today. It was a cultural thing that they would go, if one of them went to the well, they all went to the well. And so they would go as a community together in the morning. And so it's unusual that she's by herself in the heat of the day. But we'll find out in a few minutes why that was the case. She had a rough past and a bad reputation, and I think people likely avoided her because they were worried about their reputation, and she probably had gotten, she had probably grown tired of the judgmental looks and the whispers behind her back, and the shame and the rejection were the constant companions for her. When she arrived, Jesus asks her for a drink, and she wasn't sure how to respond, because here's a Jewish man talking to her and asking her for a drink, and that just wasn't done. So she calls him on it. Verse 9, the Samaritan woman said to him, you're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman, so how can you ask me for a drink? Verse 10, Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. And now she's really confused. She doesn't understand what he's talking about. She's not following the metaphor. She's thinking in terms of a physical water for her physical thirst, and she says, you don't even have a bucket to draw water from. And Jesus says, well, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a living water, and if you drink of this water, you'll never thirst again. And she's not exploring the metaphor. She just is not following it. And so Jesus decides to become a little bit more personal and direct with her. In verse 16, he said to her, go call your husband and come back. I have no husband, she replied. And Jesus said, you're right. You're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands. And the man you now have, the man you're now living with, isn't your husband. Well, what you've said is quite true. Well, that's uncomfortable, right? I mean, he just says it. Very direct. We saw this last week in the collision with Nicodemus. Jesus is, it's part of being loving that we don't always put it together, but being loving means being truthful. He's not mean or ugly. He's tender, in fact, but he's not passive aggressive, and he doesn't step away from the truth. He shoots straight. He gets her attention. He lets her know that he sees her for who she is. He knows the reality of what she's done and the situation she's in, and he knows she needs to start finding another well to draw water from, because the well of relationships, it's not quenching her thirst. It's not working. And if Jesus has an appointment with you, and I think he does for some of you, I think he would be pretty direct. He'd want you to know that he knows, because when you collide with Jesus, you collide with the truth. And so maybe he would just say it. I don't know. Maybe he would just say to you, your short temper keeps everyone around you on edge, and the bitterness is growing. Maybe he'd just say that. Maybe he would say, your drinking has gotten out of control, and it's affecting a lot more people than just you. Maybe he would just tell you, your porn problem is killing any chance of intimacy in your marriage. Maybe he would say, you're allowing your heart to fall for a girl that's causing you to fall away from God. And maybe he would say, you're choosing your live-in boyfriend over your relationship with Jesus. Maybe he would just say that. Maybe he would say, your secret sin is gonna take you to a place that you do not wanna go. Maybe he would say, your next promotion or your upgraded device or your new house, it's not gonna do anything to quench the thirst that you have. You're not gonna find it in that well. I don't know, he might say that. He does that for this woman here, and I think it gets uncomfortable. I mean, I think she felt the way some of you feel right now. I think that's how she felt. And so she does what we do when we're coming towards a collision with the truth, is we avoid the collision. We do our best to say, I think I'll turn right. And she tries it. She tries to steer him in a different direction. So after Jesus kind of says, here's your life, she says in verse 19, sir, the woman said, I can see that you're a prophet. And our ancestors worshiped at this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is Jerusalem. Oh, this will get him. He won't talk about me, and I can get him talking about religion. I can get him talking about which mountain we should worship at. That's what she does. She tries to draw him off sides by turning their conversation into a religious conversation, into a religious debate. So here's what she does. To avoid the collision, she turns the conversation towards religion and interpretive differences. And I think we still do that quite a bit. Jesus gets a little bit too personal, and we get religious. Something steps on our toes, and suddenly we want to debate eschatological views. I see this sometimes with, a sermon where it'll be perhaps confronting to someone's life, and suddenly they want to know when we talk where I stand on Calvinism, right? Because what I've learned, when someone is especially determined to talk about religion and to talk about interpretation, and a lot of times it's because they don't want to talk about themselves and what God is doing in their lives. There's oftentimes just this more personal collision that needs to take place. So I think that's true clearly for this woman, right? So she's made some assumptions about Jesus that are causing her to do her best to avoid him. Assumption number one is that he'll want nothing to do with me. This is where some of you are at. You do your best to avoid Jesus, not because you don't have an interest, but because you're pretty sure he's not interested in you. And just as she saw him as this Jewish man who wouldn't want to talk to her, some of you feel that way about Jesus. It's just that you don't think he would want anything to do with you. Another assumption she made is that he's more interested in religion than he is in my life. We talked about that. Assumption number 3 is that he's making an offer that's too good to be true. He's offering me living water and I'll never thirst again. Well, here's a woman who has been made all kinds of promises by all kinds of men in her life. And she's skeptical. She's cynical. She knows better. Her heart has been hardened. And so she makes these assumptions about Jesus that causes her to initially do her best to avoid him. And here's the reality of it. So Jesus has given he's given me the freedom to accept or reject him. And some of you are rejecting Jesus because you've made some assumptions about him that aren't even true. Maybe it was the church you grew up in, maybe it was the home you grew up in, maybe it was something from your past, but you've made these assumptions about Jesus and you're rejecting Jesus, but you're not rejecting the real Jesus, you're rejecting your assumed Jesus. And if you're gonna reject Jesus, I just wanna make sure you're rejecting the real one, not the one you've just assumed. And so Jesus wants to address this with her. And so, conversation continues. You can read a lot of this at home, but eventually the woman, I think, she just really doesn't know what to say or how to respond. So she tries to draw a conclusion to this conversation. So here's what she says, verse 25. She says, I know that the Messiah called Christ, when he comes, he'll explain everything to us. She says to Jesus, I know that, you don't know the answers to these questions either, but Jesus, when Jesus comes, he'll know the answers. And I don't know, I could be wrong. I think Jesus probably couldn't help but give a slight smile. And then Jesus says, verse 26, I, the one speaking to you, I am he. And it was just a collision she never saw coming. I mean, who would have expected that? That's usually the way these things go. So Jesus was on a collision course with her life, and I'm just wondering, if maybe that's true for you too. A few things that you can expect in case you're headed towards that intersection. First, you can expect that if Jesus is on a collision course with your life, he's gonna be on a collision course with the lies that you've believed about yourself. I mean, the fact that this woman comes in the heat of the day by herself, and it just shows how she saw herself. I don't know if it was husband number 2 or 3, or 1 through 3, but at some point she had pretty much gotten the idea, I think. She wasn't worth a lot. I mean, you don't get returned to the store that many times without feeling like you're wearing a label that says flawed, defected, damaged. The men in her life, my guess is, had devalued her and objectified her, and she didn't feel like she was worth much. That's not how Jesus sees her. That's not how Jesus sees you. If Jesus is gonna collide with your life, then here's what you can expect. If he's on a collision course, he's gonna collide with your past mistakes. He tells this woman that he knows about her past. That's scary for us. And we try to hide those things. We don't want people to know about it. So she goes, again, to this well. No one else is gonna see her. No one else is gonna be there to talk about her. And so we do our best to avoid Jesus because we know that he knows. And we think if he knows, then this is not gonna go well. It's kind of like when you owe money on a bill that you don't have money to pay for. You don't pick up the phone when the collection agency calls. If you owe money to a person, you do your best to walk around them when you see them. You don't want to see them. And so for many of us, it's how we handle Jesus. But here's the thing, Jesus just keeps coming. He keeps calling. And you think it's the collection agency. You see Jesus, you think, I know what I owe. He keeps calling, he keeps knocking, but he's not calling to collect. He's calling to let you know it's been paid for. You can be free. You don't have to live in this anymore. You don't have to stay in the darkness. You don't have to have shame and guilt as your constant companion. And I know for some of you that you think you think the worst thing that could happen to you is for your secret sin to be found out. You don't want anybody to know. That's not the worst thing. The worst thing is you go through months or years of your life and nobody knows. You just carry this weight around. You just carry it around. And the whole time, Jesus is saying, just give that to me. Just give that to me. And it takes courage. It takes courage. It takes a lot of courage. That if you've been living in the dark, to step into the light. I know that. All I'm saying is there is freedom in the light. So when the secret about my Uncle Dave's son came out, it's pretty overwhelming for him. And for decades, he had lived with the weight of that, and I think there was probably some fear in how people would respond. I mean, how would his parents, how would my grandparents respond to this news? Or what about his older brother? That's my dad. How would he respond? What would he say? And it finally came out. It was a beautiful collision. It was a little messy, but it was a beautiful collision. And so we planned for them to meet for the first time at my house here in Louisville because his son Wes lives in Virginia and my uncle lives in Missouri. And so we were gonna meet at my house in Louisville for a little family reunion where they would get to meet for the first time. And there were many tears as we watched father and son embrace for the first time. And then Wes handed his dad a gift. It was a present that was wrapped up. And he opened it up. It was a watch. Oh, that's nice. That's thoughtful. Got him a watch, just kind of as a way to remember this moment. But there were 2 words that I would later find out that were engraved on the back of that watch. 2 words. Pure grace. And something changed in my uncle's heart. And it's been beautiful to watch. I think he just, no longer felt weighed down by a lot of that. The secrets, the shame, the guilt. When you have secrets like that, it's hard to feel like anybody ever really knows you. You tend to put a wall up around everybody. You don't even know you're doing it. You just put a wall up. I emailed him a couple days ago and I asked him for permission to share the story with you guys. And I didn't really know how he'd respond. Honestly, I didn't think he would want me to. Here's the email he sent me back. Here's part of what he said. He said, "Please feel free to use my situation in any way to express God's love, mercy, and amazing grace to people who need to hear it." I don't know him like this. God has been working. It reminded me, when I read it, of the woman at the well and her response. I mean, you would think the last thing she'd want to do is let anybody know. I mean, she's doing her best to avoid people, to not talk about it. And yet, when her life collides with Jesus, verse 28 says, the woman left her water jar beside the well and ran back to the village, telling everyone, "Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be the Messiah?" And so the people came streaming from the village to see him. You wouldn't expect that. But it's a surprising thing that happens when God's grace and mercy collides with our secrets and shame, with our guilt. It's a beautiful thing. And you find that you just want to tell people about it.